Welcome to everybody for joining us. The paper, as Nathan said, is on the chat of the Zoom. The title is Drowning Mary in Anguish, Oecumenius Exegesis of Revelation 12, 14, 16 in his early Christian context. So, as you will know, Revelation 12 depicts a conflict between these three parties: the woman, her son, and the dragon. Revelation 12:1-6 set the stage of this conflict by narrating how the dragon wants to devour the recent-born son of the woman. After the dragon comes to terms with the fact that the son of the woman is untouchable, he then goes on to try to destroy the woman, only to be left wanting, since the woman is taken to the desert, where she will be safe for at least 1,260 days. After a brief interval between verses 7 and 12, where a heavenly battle takes place between the dragon and Michael, verses 13 and 14 recapitulate verses 5 and 6. That is, verses 13 and 14 retell the story of the woman going to the desert after being persecuted by the dragon. However, verses 15 and 16 move the narrative forward by adding certain details to the scene of the woman in the desert. So, verses 15 and 16 narrate how the snake spits water out of her mouth into the desert, hoping to drown the woman. The earth, that is the desert's earth, absorbs the water, lending help in this way to the woman. And this is kind of the story of Revelation 12, and you see on the screen the text, right? So the woman is in the desert, the serpent spits water out of her mouth in order to drown her, but the earth helped the woman. So when we look at the early Christian exegesis of this pericope, we see that most of the Latin tradition understood verses 15 and 16 as a representation of the ongoing struggles the church will have to face between Jesus' first and second coming. And we have Tychonius at the head of the Latin tradition, and after that, everyone who follows Tychonius understand these verses as the ongoing struggles of the church. The Greek tradition, and over here we're talking about Andrew of Caesarea, Aretas of Caesarea, and one Latin commentator, the first one, Victorinus, they thought this passage was proof of a future period of persecution that will take place once the Antichrist rises and secures power. And on the other hand, we'll have the anonymous Syriac commentator who sees in this passage an allusion to the satanic doctrines that overflow the earth. Now, when we move to Oecumenius, the first Greek commentator of the Apocalypse, writing sometime in the 6th century, he interprets Revelation 12, 15, 16 in the following way. And you have either in the paper or in the presentation his interpretation. He thinks that the divine scripture means allegorically by the river, temptation, or trial. Here, the translator is representing the ambiguity with the word peirasmos in Greek. Therefore, he calls her trial over the passion of the Lord a river, so that through this, he says he might drown the virgin. And truly, by what happened to the Lord and to the intensity of her sorrow, the serpent had the power to fulfill his purpose. What does Simon say to her? And a sword will pierce your own soul too, so that the thoughts of many hearts may be laid bare. Quoting Luke 2:35. So now we see that in the context of what we possess from the early Christian exegesis of Revelation 12, Oecumenius' interpretation of verses 15 and 16 represents a singularity within the vast hermeneutical universe of interpretations of this passage. Now, the main question that occupies us in this paper is, why does Oecumenius interpret in this way? So this paper logically intends to answer this question, attending to the exegetical process Oecumenius followed to reach his conclusion that Revelation 12 15 and 16 represented Mary's suffering at the cross. Now, the first step to ascertain Oecumenius Exegesis of Revelation 12, 15, 16 is to take a look at his interpretation of Revelation 12 in general. So for Oecumenius, the primary subject matter of Revelation 12 is the Antichrist. That is, he states this in his introduction to Revelation 12. Revelation 12 is about the Antichrist. Yet, Oecumenius thinks that Revelation, before describing future events, the book describes past events, since the future is often grounded on the past. So Oecumenius, in this point, he reasons why does Satan rise the Antichrist up? So because he says that Satan is the responsible for the rising of the Antichrist. When he asks about the purpose of the Antichrist, he will answer that the Antichrist will undo the work of the incarnation. So this is Oecumenius' statement. If you want to understand the work of the Antichrist, you first need to understand the work of the incarnation, since the work of the Antichrist is based on what Christ did on his incarnation. So now, when you get to the incarnation, you need to begin at the beginning of the incarnation, and that would be the birth of Christ. So since Revelation 12 introduces itself with the vision of a pregnant woman, then Oecumenius concludes that Revelation 12 is narrating the beginning of the incarnation of Christ, that is, the birth of Christ. Therefore, he takes the woman to be Mary, the son of the woman is Christ, and the dragon is Satan, because the text of Revelation itself interprets the symbol in this way. Now, a main tenet within the plot of Revelation 12 is the conflict between the dragon and the woman and her son. So the dragon is purposely, and he has every intention of destroying either the woman or the son of the woman. So Oecumenius interprets Revelation 12 as a representation of Satan trying to destroy Christ and Mary. And he tries to do this in several attempts. The first attempt is symbolized by the dragon trying to devour the son of the woman. That is verse 4 of Revelation 12. And Oecumenius interprets this as Satan influencing the King Herod to kill Christ in the massacre of the innocents described in Matthew chapter 2. Since the dragon aims at killing a baby, and that baby is Christ, there is only one other text in the whole New Testament that depicts someone trying to kill Christ as a baby. That is Matthew chapter 2. So what Oecumenius does is that he reads Matthew 2 and Revelation 12 intertextually, and come to the conclusion that Satan was influencing Herod to kill Christ as a baby. So once Satan realizes that he cannot touch the baby because the baby is taken to God on his throne, the second attempt then captures the dragon and the dragon's endeavor to kill the woman, that in Oecumenius' minds represent Satan trying to kill Mary through Herod. And in Oecumenius' mind, after Herod failed to kill Christ, he also wanted to kill Mary, right? So for Oecumenius, this is the second attempt of the dragon trying to destroy either Christ or the woman. So we see that his action failed because Mary goes to Egypt for 3.5 years, where she will be protected. That is Oecumenius' interpretation of the woman going to the desert. So first attempt then is Satan trying to devour Christ as a baby. Second attempt is Satan trying to destroy Mary in the massacre of the innocents as well. So when we go to Revelation 12, 13, and 14, this for Oecumenius represent exactly the same thing that Revelation 12, 5, and 6. That is Mary going to Egypt to be saved from Herod. Now, when we get to Revelation 12, 15, 16, we see that, as we said, that this passage moves the narrative forward, and Oecumenius gets that. So he proposes that Revelation 12, 15, 16 is describing the second attempt of Satan at destroying Mary. That is the third attempt of destroying either Christ or Mary in total. But the second, in particular, of Satan, the second attempt of Satan at destroying Mary. So the attempt of destroying Mary described in Revelation 12, 15, 16 is different from the one described in the verses in chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, right? So since the first attempt at destroying Mary was made when Jesus was a baby, and the narrative has moved forward, the second attempt must be placed further in Jesus' life, so likely in his adulthood. So we have, once again, right, the Oecumenius interpretation of the passage, and we see that he places this attempt of Satan at the cross, right? So he moves and he understands this pericope differently from verses 13 and 14. Now that we have we have come to this point, we are in good place to ask, okay, but what is that Satan's last attempt to destroy the woman, right? So as we are seeing on the screen, Revelation 12, 15, 16 affirms that the dragon spits water out of his mouth. And Oecumenius takes this as his cue to suggest that Satan will test or tempt Mary based on the early Christian understanding of water bodies as temptations or trials. So for Oecumenius, rivers are equal to peirasmos, right? So, and we have the ambiguity of this word that is either a temptation or a trial. But the river for Oecumenius is the peirasmos. And we see over here that Oecumenius is building on the early Christian understanding of rivers and water bodies as peirasmos. We have, for instance, Maximus, that he says that waters are, that it is found in many places of scripture, the temptation trials, right, the peirasmoi. And Cyril of Alexandria, in his commentary on Isaiah, he says that rivers, waters, and flames of fire represent the multiple attacks of the trials, temptations, right? Once again, we see how water bodies in general, but rivers in particular, are interpreted as trial temptations in the early Christian understanding. Now, Oecumenius interprets the mention of rivers in the text of Revelation as trial temptations because he's appealing to Matthew chapter 7, 25, and Jonah chapter 2, verse 4, to argue that river conveys the idea of temptation trial. So, and he interprets, Oecumenius interprets Matthew 7, 25 and Jonah 2, 4 in this way, because as we have said, he's building on this notion of Cyril and Maximus, where water bodies and rivers represent trials, temptations. Now, we have, therefore, that the last attempt of Satan at destroying Mary is a trial temptation, and that is related with that event of the light of Jesus. So the quick question now is, which event, right? So Oecumenius answered that the event in question is the passion of the Lord, right? So the passion of the Lord is the river, is the trial temptation that Satan would employ to destroy Mary. But this begs the question of, well, why the passion of the Lord could be weaponized by Satan as a temptation trial for Mary. So when we get to this point, we remember, right? Just as the dragon spits water out of his mouth to drown the woman, so the water is the instrument of drowning. So Satan hoped to drown Mary through the passion of the Lord. So the verb translated as drown is the Greek verb apoknigo. And we see in Oecumenius' statement, in the first one that appeared in the paper, that the action implied by apoknigo would be done through the passion of the Lord, right? He says that he would drown the virgin, diatuto, through the passion of the Lord. So since the passion of the Lord could not drown Mary literally, so apoknigo must be employed here by Oecumenius in his metaphorical sense. So when we look at the metaphorical sense of apoknigo, it means to being in a state of, being overwhelmed being emotionally exhausted, being vexed, being burnt out. So it basically means to be an academic these days. So we see, for instance, in the presentation, Antiphanes, he says that he's exhausted emotionally, that that there is a troubling feeling in his mind when somebody speaks in a new dialect to him. And we also have an example there by Callimachus, where the verb is employed in the same sense, that is, of being overwhelmed, emotionally exhausted. So what we have, therefore, is that Satan's last attempt to destroy Mary is that he wanted to make her feel overwhelmed. I mean, Satan wanted Mary to feel overwhelmed with the sufferings that Jesus was undergoing on the cross. So Satan's plan was to crush Mary with great sufferings, with anguish. So what he wanted was to drown her, yes, but not literally, but emotionally, with anguish as the result of the sufferings of her son at the cross. And Oecumenius thinks that given that Jesus suffered a lot in the cross, so his plan could actually accomplish his purpose. That was destroying Mary. So basically, Oecumenius is saying that Satan tried to destroy physically Mary at the massacre of the innocents, so he failed. And then he tries once again to destroy Mary, but this time not physically, but emotionally. So he wanted to drown Mary in emotions, in anxiety, in anguish, to the point where she would fail in despair, in disappointment, and even would doubt his son's divinity. Now, one key question right now is therefore, well, why Oecumenius, right? How did Oecumenius arrive at the conclusion that Jesus' suffering would drown Mary emotionally? So we have to take a step back and remember that Oecumenius has an incarnational approach to Revelation. That is, that he believes Christ and his work are the main topic of the book, right? For instance, 7 seals are just a description of Christ and his work, of the incarnation. So although he believes Revelation deals with future events, these events are just the result of Christ's work in the past. So in order to understand the future, you need to go back to the past. So Revelation 12, as we have said, it is about how Satan is about Satan's effort to destroy Christ, right? So since Revelation 12, 15, 16, the pit and attack of Satan to Mary, different from the one already registered in Revelation. So Oecumenius is left wondering which event in Jesus' life, right, could affect Mary in such a way that would make her emotionally anguish. And when he's thinking about that, only one biblical text speaks about Mary experiencing something akin to suffering in Jesus' adulthood, and that is Luke 2:35. So we are going to see that there are two, but actually very related a strand of interpretations regarding Luke 2:35. The first one is just Christian authors who thought that the sword in Luke 2:35 represented the mental anguish Mary would experience when seeing his son on the cross. And one representation of this long strand of tradition is Origen. For instance, in his homilies on Luke, he says that you heard from Gabriel, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. The sword of infidelity will pierce you, and you will be struck by the blade of uncertainty, and your thoughts will tear you in pieces when you see him. You had heard him called the Son of God. You knew he was begotten without a man's seed. You knew he was crucified and died and subjected to human punishment. So in this strand of interpretation, the sword that will pierce Mary's soul is just the uncertainty, the anguish, the emotions that she would experience at the cross. But there is a second line of interpretation. There is over here some examples if you want to track these references down. There is a second strand of interpretation that is exemplified by Cyril of Alexandria, And Cyril would argue that Mary would not only be mentally anguished and overwhelmed, but that these feelings would even lead her to doubt his son's divinity. So there is a kind of a long quotation, but over here we have it. So the unexpected suffering that happened to the Lord probably caused even the Lord's mother to stumble, and the exceedingly bitter death on the cross displays a little of her fitting reflection. On top of that, the same effect was produced by the insults of the Jews and the soldiers who quickly came to the cross and ridiculed him who hung there and who had the audacity to divide his clothes in front of his mother. You should not doubt that she entertained considerations such as this. I gave birth to him who is mocked on the tree. Perhaps he was wrong when he said that he was the true son of the Almighty God. Maybe he was in error when he said, I am the life. How could he be crucified? How could he be ensnared in the necks of murderers? How could he not overcome the schemes of his persecutors? He commanded Lazarus to return to life and struck all Judea with astonishment. Why does he not come down from the cross? It is probable that the woman, not understanding the mystery, slipped into such a train of thought. And actually, if you read the whole of Cyril's commentary on this passage that he's commenting on Mary at the cross, you see that he will affirm like explicitly that Mary doubted his son's divinity due to the feelings of anguish, of being emotionally drained, of being vexed at the suffering of her son. So this is actually Origen will have this a similar interpretation. We will have this interpretation in other early Christian writers as well. So what we see, therefore, is that Luke 2:35 and his early Christian interpretation provided Oecumenius what was missing from his puzzle. So which event in Jesus' life could be turned by Satan into a trial temptation for Mary? And the answer is, well, Jesus' death. So what we see, therefore, is that Oecumenius needs a text that suggests, affirms that Mary would suffer, right, in a certain point when Jesus is an adult, in order to fit his interpretation of Revelation 12:15-16. So he finds in Luke 2:35 the answer to his puzzle. And he then maps over Luke 2:35 over Revelation 12:15-16. And he transferred the meaning of Luke into Revelation. Since Revelation represented Satan's last attempt at destroying Mary, well, Oecumenius deduced, thanks to Luke 2:35, that the suffering of Mary at the cross could be Satan's weapon against her. In this way, we see that Oecumenius added Revelation 12:15-16 to the list of patristic testimonia that affirmed that Mary would suffer by seeing Jesus die. We have a long list of texts that were employed by early Christian writers to support the idea that Mary would suffer at the cross. So what Oecumenius is doing here is just adding Revelation 12 to that list. But he is able to do that because he's reading Revelation 12 with Luke 2:35 intertextually. That is really important. And since he's reading intertextually, it's not only a matter of how Luke 2:35 influenced Revelation 12:15-16, but also Revelation 12:15-16 influenced Luke 2:35. Since you will notice that the mention of Satan is nowhere to be found, neither in Luke 2:35 or in the interpretation of the early Christian interpretation of Luke 2:35. Thus, Luke 2:35 gave Oecumenius an event which he could then accommodate into his interpretation of Revelation 12. That is true. But Revelation 12 gave satanic overtones to the understanding of Luke 2:35. Since after Oecumenius reads these two texts together, the idea that it is Satan who causes Mary to suffer at the cross, you cannot exclude it based on how Oecumenius is able to read intertextually both Revelation 12:15-16 and Luke 2:35. So this is an exercise of intertextual reading, and it exemplifies that when two texts are read together, it's hard to read them apart after their union, since their meaning is dialogically transformed. So as the conclusion, we see that Oecumenius presents a unique interpretation of Revelation 12:15-16. and that this interpretation stems from his idea of Revelation 12 as a map of Satan's conflict with Christ and Mary, right? So in his idea, Satan tries to destroy Mary in 2 moments: at Jesus' birth and then in his adulthood. Satan's second attempt consists of a trial temptation, as we have seen, due to the symbolic meaning of river in early Christian thought. And since Oecumenius interpret this passage as a trial temptation, what he needs to find then is which trial temptation in Jesus' adulthood, or which event, sorry, in Jesus' adulthood could be weaponized as a trial temptation for Mary. So Oecumenius finds then in Luke 2:35 a passage interpreted as the mental anguish Mary would experience when seeing his son at the cross. And these events, therefore, Oecumenius understands is what would destroy Mary. So Oecumenius reads Luke 2:35 into Revelation 12, 15, 16, and he reads these passages intertextually. So consequently, Revelation 12, 15, 16 represents Satan tried to anguish Mary through the sufferings of Jesus, hoping that this would drown her emotionally and thus would destroy her. We see then that patristic exegesis is intertextual by nature. And further, we see that Revelations exegesis in early Christianity often intended to connect revelation to topics already established as orthodox by the mainstream thinkers, so that revelation would be perceived as orthodox by association. Oecumenius represents one of the most intelligent attempts at making revelation orthodox and rescuing the book from the heterodox shadows where it was located in the East after the 4th century. And this is everything. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian, for this talk and for assisting me in filling up an entire page of questions. A lot of what you said triggered a lot of thoughts. And I think maybe has for a number of people here on this call who may also be familiar with Oecumenius's text.
But before asking the question, you need to see my last slide. Don't ask any difficult questions.
Okay, we'll only ask you easy ones. Easy for us to ask and hard for you to answer. Is that what you meant? And if I could, I'm gonna set up my Zoom here, so hopefully I see people as they ask questions here. So if you have questions, go ahead and raise your hand digitally, and then we will just proceed until the top of the hour in this way. And we'll start with Ian Paul.
Hi, thank you, Christian. That was really fascinating. I've got my copy of Oecumenius here to hand. I was really interested that he seems to be very strong in some areas, but in each area he's also got some weaknesses. So as you say, he's reading intertextually, and yet he completely misses the intertextual allusion to Daniel in the times and half a time, or 1260 days, which is really bizarre. So he takes it as a literal time period. And again, he pays attention to the narrative shape. And yet the obvious narrative shape at the beginning is the child is snatched to God, whereas the woman goes into the desert. And he just completely ignores that. He says, oh, well, the snatching up to God is through Joseph's dream, which is a really weird way to read the text. And so I just kind of, if you had any reflections on his sort of inconsistency in that. And I think the other thing I was really interested in is, again, he conflates the beast with the Antichrist, even though Antichrist, of course, is not mentioned. I was quite surprised to see that at such an early point. Is that was that well established in the tradition by then? Do you know? Sorry, that's two questions in one.
Thank
Three
you,
questions
Ian.
in one.
Yeah, I mean, his exegesis is really, I know that this troubles certain historians, but he's really original. And I think that is because he's reading Revelation with a sort of text that were not so common to read with in this period. So the main intertext for Oecumenius in this passage is actually Matthew chapter 2. And that is what leads him to to miss these certain things with Daniel, or even fall into inconsistencies. So yeah, I mean, I think that he sees Mary and Christ, and he imagines that this is about the birth of Christ, and then he looks for the passage where he could read with Revelation 12, and he finds Matthew 2, and then he just goes with it. So in one sense, he preserved the consistency of his reading by being honest about what reading Revelation 12 and Matthew 2 would entail, right? But at the same time, one perceives an inconsistency when we try to, read his reading of Revelation 12 with other texts that maybe he didn't have those texts in mind. So I think that is what is going on, but he tries really hard to preserve the consistency of his interpretation. Actually, we see, for instance, that he only goes and recurs to allegory when there is something in the text that won't fit his kind of literal incarnational reading of Revelation. So he's committed to consistency, but within his own boundaries, within his limits. I don't know, that is helpful for the first question. Is that okay?
It is, and I think you're reminding me. I mean, his reading is a much better, much more developed, much more disciplined one than, say, for instance, Methodius in the Symposium of the 12 Virgins, where he just goes off on flights of fancy, almost literally.
Yeah, exactly. And for your second question of the conflation of Satan and the beast, we have certain
Antichrist. It's just he's used the word Antichrist.
Sorry. With the Antichrist, we do have certain apocryphal texts that kind of preserve the same idea that that the Antichrist is just Satan incarnated. I mean, it will depend on when you date these certain apocryphal apocalypses or even apocryphal texts. Because if it's 4th, 5th century, well, then the idea was before Oecumenius or contemporary with him. But yeah, we do have that idea of Satan being just the Antichrist incarnated, as Oecumenius does. And I actually think that is why Andrew rejects his interpretation of Revelation 13, because Andrew will depend on Irenaeus' interpretation of Revelation 13 and the Antichrist. So he will go like with a really orthodox, Andrew will go with a really orthodox view of the Antichrist. Well, Oecumenius, he's kind of like trying to innovate, and maybe he went with this one, but it was not so mainstream as the other one. So yeah.
Thank you, Ian, for that question. We'll move now to my colleague here in Regensburg, Emanuela Valeriani.
Yes, thank you, Cristian. And first question comes from, the last things you were saying, because are you thinking to the first apocryphal apocalypse of John when you talk about apocryphal apocalypses that talk about the Antichrist as incarnate Satan? First question, because if the answer is yes, I just say that I wouldn't agree about this. And second question is that you talk about orthodox and heterodox related to Revelation. So you said that Oecumenius Exegesis is trying to, or attempt is to make to defend Revelation. So the use of some texts like Luke 2:35 it's an attempt to give a sort of orthodoxy, if I well understood, to Revelation. So I would like to go into, if you can say something more about this idea of Oecumenius to make the Revelation more orthodox. Just if you could find other places in his exegesis to Revelation in which you have this feeling. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I was going to mention you if you wanted to answer the second question by Ian, because I knew that you had more insight into the tradition of the Antichrist. No, I'm not thinking of the first apocryphal apocalypse of John. but rather on the pseudo Hippolytus of the Consumatione Mundi. He preserves the idea that the Antichrist is just Satan incarnated. I think that the Apocalypse of Elijah, the Coptic one, might be read in that way. I actually think that the portrait of the Antichrist in the first apocryphal Apocalypse of John is rather different from what we find in these other apocryphal texts. I mean, different in certain aspects, but it shares some common traits with the Antichrist myth in general. Yeah, but I wasn't thinking about that one in my answer to Ian. As for the second question, yeah, I mean, when we read Oecumenius commentary, just the introduction, we see an intention by Oecumenius to establish revelation as orthodox. He actually appeals to several church fathers who took the book as inspired and as truly written by John. And then we will also find that when he interprets certain passages in Revelation, he tries to escape. He tries to escape the traditional interpretations that got Revelation into trouble. For instance, when he goes to the millennium, to the 1,000 years, so he will go and say, you know what, this is about the incarnation of Christ. And in that way, he will avoid this chiastic interpretation that wasn't really good in the eyes of his contemporaries. And when he says, well, this is about the incarnation of Christ, people will say, okay, we love the incarnation of Christ. The incarnation of Christ is a good topic. So if Revelation talks about this, well, Revelation then is good. It's a good book. We should study. We should keep thinking about it. So I think that is why he tries to avoid conflicting interpretations and always tries to connect Revelation with well-established points and doctrines by this moment. Although I imagine that Revelation in the East, in the Greek-speaking world, had a resurgence a little bit before Oecumenius appears in the picture, because if he's writing a commentary, it's because people are reading Revelation and then are asking questions about it. So the book must come out of the shadows a little bit before Oecumenius appears. But I think that his interpretation and then Andrew will kind of solidify Revelation's position in the East.
Thank you very much. All right, let's move now to Régis Brunet and Louvain-la-Neuve.
Thank you, Cristian. I knew it was wonderful, but it was really wonderful. I have a question that may be a little difficult. Do you think that we could read this text from a gender perspective? I mean, we see this woman who is overwhelmed by her emotions. What does it tell us about this very particular representation of femininity? Have you an idea of the theory of emotions of Oecumenius? Do you know on what it is based?
No, I don't. And it is a really difficult question. I haven't thought about it, honestly, so I will have to think deeper. So thank you for pushing the boundary. I don't have much to say on it. I mean, if you have, please give us your thoughts about it. Maybe we could understand that a little better, but yeah, I don't have any thoughts on that.
Anything to add, Régis, or should we move on?
No, it was really a question. I have no idea.
All right, so Cristian not only gets to deliver a paper, but he gets another crack at an interesting question in the future. I think there's a quick comment here from Tom Schmidt at Fairfield in the United States. He says, Oecumenius also says at the end of his commentary that, quote, the nonsense of the majority, talks about the nonsense of the majority, do not think that the evangelist John actually wrote Revelation. So, Tom, if we want to come back to that in a minute, I think I have a hand from Ian Boxall at St. Stephen's House at Oxford.
Okay, thank you, Cristian. That was fantastic, as I thought it would be. So I've got easy questions for you. So so I was kind of puzzled, thinking intertextually. I mean, the Gospel of John is an obvious place for Oecumenius to go, both chapter 19 and then also that peculiar reference to the image of the pregnant woman in John 16 as well. So, I mean, does he get to the Gospel of John at all? Where the only place where the mother of Jesus is at the foot of the cross. And my other kind of question was, I guess in terms of reception, maybe it's unlikely that it's Oecumenius directly, but I mean, you do get this connection between Revelation 12 and Matthew 2 appearing much later in the Latin tradition. So in Berengor's commentary, and you get these illuminations of the flight into Egypt and the massacre of the innocents juxtaposed with the woman and the dragon in some 13th century Anglo-Norman apocalypses. I mean, how widespread after Oecumenius is this idea of the massacre of the innocents, the flight into Egypt, as being played out in Revelation 12? Okay.
Thank you, Ian, for being here and for your questions. As for the first one, Oecumenius, as far as I can tell, he missed, as well as Ian Paul was saying, the connection here between Revelation and John. He quote Luke 2:35 explicitly. However, when we look at the resection of Luke 2:35, it is intertwined with John chapter 19. So maybe, and I think Oecumenius maybe does this in other places, so why not here? He's looking at John through the eyes of Luke. So since Luke and John is already connected in the early Christian interpretation of these two texts, I mean, for instance, in the quotation I display on the slide from the commentary of from Cyril of Alexandria, Cyril is interpreting John 19, but a little bit before the quotation, Cyril connects Luke with John. So these two texts are together in the early Christian tradition. So maybe is that Oecumenius prefers to quote Luke 2:35, but at the same time is thinking with John 19, like they are together at that point. As for the second, the idea of Revelation 12 with Matthew chapter 2 already appears in Tychonius. And actually, we see that Tychonius and Oecumenius interpret in the same way I mean, when I say that they interpret in the same way, I mean that both of them come to the conclusion that Satan is leading Herod to kill Christ as a baby. However, they get to the point in two different ways. Tychonius gets there because the principle of recapitulation in his rules, and he sees that something that is happening or that will happen in the future already happened in the past. So he thinks that the conflict between good and bad brothers within the church is illustrated by the conflict between Herod and Christ when Herod tries to kill Christ as a baby. So he takes that as the historical reference from which the idea of the body of the devil within the church will try to devour and will try to destroy the good brothers in it. So maybe it's Tychonius who is influencing later readers. I would love to email you after this if you could maybe point out to me the visual representations of this, because I would love to see them. This is a little bit of self-promotion. I don't like to do it, but I published an article in Spanish, but I published an article earlier this year on analyzing both Tychonius and Oecumenius readings of Revelation 12 with Matthew 2. So probably I can send it to you, and I don't know if you read the Spanish. If not, artificial intelligence can translate very quickly these days. So.
Yeah, thank you, Cristian. Yeah, I'd be very happy to do that. And of course, Tychonius completely slipped my mind. And he's the obvious connection with those, Bede and Beatus, and then that just feeds into the Anglo-Norman tradition. Okay, thanks.
No, thanks to you.
And now we'll move back across the Atlantic to Tom Schmidt.
Thanks, Cristian. That was a fine paper. I just wanted to follow up with my little comment in the chat, which related to a question that you answered a few questions ago about whether Oecumenius was trying to defend Revelation from criticism, and I just wanted to add that yes, I think he absolutely was, and I think he makes that clear at the end of his commentary, where from at least his community, it seems like he's in the minority in viewing Revelation as an authoritative work. And so I think it's very fair. I think everything you pointed out was great, but that often when Oecumenius is arguing for an interpretation, I think that can often fairly be read in the light of hostile interpreters, not just an interpreter that is differing in his understanding of it, but one that has a negative view of Revelation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Big fan of your monograph, by the way.
Good. All right. I think we have time for one or two short questions, or one big question, I suppose.
You said you had a whole page.
I do. I'm just, it's the dilemma of choice here. I guess I was interested in what you feel might have compelled Oecumenius in this direction toward a Mariological reading. I'm struck with the kind of the ongoing controversy of whether or not controversy, but the open question as to whether Oecumenius was in fact a Miaphysite or not. And I'm just wondering if the kind of the rich Christological content of his interpretation of the seven seals and the millennium is referring to Christ's life. If perhaps because of that hermeneutic or that way of approaching the text of Revelation, that he just simply finds room for Mary there, or I'm just kind of wondering what your hunch is as to, you mentioned he's original at a number of places. Originality springs out of something. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts as to what he might be reading, what he might be doing, what may have brought him in this direction.
Well, that is a really nice question. I don't know why he chose to read Revelation like Christologically. That is a really good question. I do know, at least I propose that his Mariological reading of Revelation 12 is, his main concern is not Mary, it's Christ.
Right.
And he gets to Mary is just because Mary is the logical step when you need to talk about the birth of Christ. In fact, in Revelation 12, when he describes the woman, he has a long passage of attributes that he highlights from the woman. But one of them is that she is homoousios with humanity, because in that way he's ensuring that Jesus is homoousios with us. So Jesus had shared the same essence with the Father, but at the same time he shares the same essence with the humans. And in this way, he kind of like tries to defend his Christology. Well, not to defend, but at least to articulate his Christology. So when he talks about Mary or something else, he just usually is because Christ is at the center. When he even speaks about eschatology in the trumpets, he like for him the trumpets are just the descriptions of what is going to happen when Jesus comes back, you know, at the parousia. So Christ is the center for him. That is the key for his hermeneutics. But why? That is a really good question. I don't know.
Good. Okay, yeah, it's reading Oecumenius is just always fascinating, and just is so surprising in so many ways, theologically, textually, in a number of ways. Anyway, thank you very much, Cristian, for your talk today. I think we've all enjoyed it very much, and I hope your students have as well, many of whom joined us today. At this point, I just simply again want to remind participants to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, X. We try to make all of our announcements about upcoming events there. We also have an email list, so you can email me, nathan.betts@ur.be, and I will sign you up to that. And finally, the next paper that we will have is not been announced yet. In fact, it's only been recently developing, and we will be on December the 7th, which was to have been a blank week because the presenter had to reschedule. We will have Franziska Müller, also of Regensburg, who will be presenting on her doctoral project on Beatus, and particularly, I think, the Geneva Beatus and the text illumination relation that we find there. So next month, 5 p.m. Germany time, December 7th, we will have Franziska Müller of Regensburg on the Geneva Beatus. Until then, everybody do good work, and see you then.